The January freeze had settled over Halifax like a judgment, turning the harbour into grey glass and the streets into something that felt less like a city and more like a warning. Rowan Keach stood outside the back entrance of the Hotel Laundry building on Barrington Street, her hands pressed flat against the concrete wall to stop them from shaking. It was not the cold. She had learned to stop feeling the cold 3 months ago. Around the same time, she had stopped feeling most things. It was the letter in her coat pocket, the one she had read so many times the creases had gone white, the one that said her mother's treatment at the Victoria General would be suspended if the outstanding balance was not cleared within 14 days. 14 days. She had been counting. There were 6 left. Her shift started in 20 minutes. She would go inside, change into the uniform that was slightly too large across the shoulders, and spend the next 8 hours pressing tablecloths and folding napkins into shapes that made wealthy guests feel that someone, somewhere, cared deeply about the geometry of their dinner. She had been doing this for 4 months, since losing the teaching position at Dartmouth High, when the school board cut the arts program and half its staff in a single Wednesday afternoon meeting. She had smiled through the exit interview. She had thanked the vice principal by name. She had walked to her car in the parking lot and sat for a long time looking at nothing before driving to her mother's apartment to not tell her what had happened. Her mother, Geraldine Keach, did not need more bad news. Geraldine was 63 years old and had spent the last 2 years fighting a cancer that the doctors described in careful, measured language that always seemed designed to manage expectations rather than inspire hope. She was small and fierce, and she still did the crossword every morning, still called Rowan at 7:30 on Sundays as she always had, still said she was fine even when the medication left her unable to eat for days at a time. Rowan had not told her about the letter. She had not told her about the second job at the cafe on Gottingen Street, or the third job filling online surveys for grocery money, or the $400 she had borrowed from her friend Darcy that she had no real plan to repay. There was a version of her life, not very far in the past, where none of this would have been possible, where she had a salary and a classroom and students who rolled their eyes at her enthusiasm for Atwood and called her Miss Keach with the particular exasperation of teenagers who were secretly paying attention. She missed that version. She missed it the way you miss a country you used to live in, with a longing that was less about specific places and more about who you were when you were there. She went inside. The laundry floor was loud and hot, all machinery and steam, and the particular rhythm of industrial pressing that you stopped hearing after the first hour and started hearing again when you got home and tried to sleep. Rowan changed in the staff locker room, tied her hair back. It was longer than she had kept it in years, past her shoulder blades now, because haircuts cost $40, and she had decided some time ago that $40 was not something she could spend on herself, and went to her station. The shift supervisor, a woman named Brenda who had been running this floor for 11 years and had a gift for identifying the exact moment a person was about to make a mistake, nodded at Rowan when she arrived. No words. Just the nod that meant you are on time. Good. That is all I require from you. Rowan liked Brenda. She liked people who said exactly what they meant and nothing more. It was near the end of her shift, 9:45, when the commotion started. Not commotion exactly, more like a change in the quality of the air, the way the room became slightly more alert, slightly more careful. 2 men had come onto the floor. They did not belong there. You could tell by the way they moved, like people who were used to walking into rooms where the normal rules had been suspended for their benefit. Dark overcoats, quiet shoes, the kind of stillness about them that came from knowing they did not have to rush. Behind them was a third man. He was taller than both of them and had the kind of face that made you want to look, and then made you feel slightly foolish for looking. Dark hair going silver at the temples, a jaw that seemed carved with the specific intention of looking like it was made to carry difficult decisions. He was perhaps 45, perhaps older, in the way that some men got older without seeming diminished by it. He wore a charcoal suit with no tie, and his hands, when he crossed his arms and looked around the room, were the hands of someone who had done physical work at some point in his life and had never entirely left it behind. Brenda met them at the edge of the floor. Rowan could not hear the conversation, but she watched it. The tall man was not aggressive. He was not loud. She simply explained something in a way that made Brenda listen with her full attention, nodding twice, and then glance around the room in a way that landed, briefly, on Rowan. Rowan looked back down at the tablecloth in front of her. 30 seconds later, Brenda was at her elbow. "Keach," she said, "they need to speak with you." Rowan set down the iron. "Me? You?" Brenda's expression did not give anything away, but she was not alarmed. That was something. "It is about the hotel side. Something about the gala event next Saturday." "Go on." The tall man's name was Gabriel Ashworth. He said it simply without title or context. The name alone offered as if it were enough, and from the way the two men flanking him seemed to track her reaction, she understood it was expected to be. She did not react because she did not know who he was. This seemed to surprise him slightly, just slightly, a small recalibration behind the eyes. "You were a teacher," he said. It was not a question. "I was," Rowan said. "Before that, you studied French literature at Dalhousie. You tutored privately for 3 years. You also speak, according to the woman at the cafe on Göttingen, passable Mandarin from a semester abroad in your 2nd year." Rowan felt the skin at the back of her neck tighten. "You spoke to Darcy. I spoke to several people." He said it without apology. Not cruelly, but not gently either. Simply as a fact, the way a person described weather. "I have a problem, Miss Keach. My problem is that I am hosting a dinner next Saturday evening for 12 guests, 3 of whom are from Quebec and 1 of whom is from Shanghai. My assistant, who was managing the translation and the cultural coordination for this event, left my employ 2 weeks ago. I have not been able to find a replacement who meets the requirements of the role." Rowan looked at him. "And you're offering me the position. I am asking if you are interested in a conversation about it." She should have said no. She was aware, in a cold and analytical corner of her mind, that this was the kind of situation that asked you to trust too quickly, to follow someone somewhere because they had done their research on you and spoken about you to people you knew, and that being researched was not the same as being safe. She was aware of all of this. She was also aware of the letter in her coat pocket. 6 days. "When?" she said. He named a time the following morning. An address on the South End Peninsula, near Point Pleasant Park, the kind of neighborhood where the houses had names rather than numbers, and had been owned by the same 3 families for 4 generations. Rowan wrote it down on the back of a receipt she found in her apron. When she got home that night, she sat at the kitchen table of her apartment for a long time. The apartment was small and well organized, because she had learned that orderly spaces were one of the things that kept anxiety from becoming something worse. There were drawings on the refrigerator. Her nephew Elliot's, 8 years old, who came to stay with her every second weekend when her sister Lynn could not manage alone. Elliot drew dogs and spaceships and elaborate maps of cities that did not exist. Rowan found his maps more comforting than she could explain. She looked up the name Gabriel Ashworth. He had built his company from a single shipping contract in his late 20s into one of the largest private logistics firms operating out of Atlantic Canada. He had interests in 3 ports, a cold storage facility in Dartmouth, a consulting arm that worked with the federal government on supply chain security. There were articles about him in the Chronicle Herald, in Maclean's, in a business magazine she had never heard of with very glossy paper. He was described as decisive, private, effective. There was one photograph from a charity gala, taken from the side, in which he was looking at something outside the frame with an expression that was difficult to read. There was also a brief mention, in an older article, of a sister who had died. The article did not say how. It moved on quickly, the way articles did when they were not sure how much weight a detail should carry. She went to the address the next morning. The house was older than she had expected, a Victorian that had been maintained carefully rather than renovated aggressively, which meant it still had the proportions of something built for people who had different ideas about ceilings and rooms and the relationship between interior space and weather. A man she would later know as Patrick opened the door and showed her to a sitting room that smelled like coffee and old books, and the particular wood smoke smell of a real fireplace that had been used that morning. Gabriel Ashworth came in 4 minutes later. He was wearing different clothes, but the same quality of stillness, like someone who had never learned to fidget because fidgeting served no purpose. He offered her coffee. She accepted. They sat across from each other at a small table by the window, and outside the garden was bare and frost-covered, and looked like something waiting. He explained the role. The dinner on Saturday was with investors and partners, some of whom were considering a significant commitment to a new expansion into Quebec and Asia. He needed someone who could facilitate, not just translate, but navigate the social and cultural registers that made the difference between a meeting that progressed and one that stalled. He had read a paper she had written in her 3rd year at Dalhousie about cultural mediation in post-colonial literary contexts. He produced a printed copy of it from the folder in front of him. Rowan looked at the paper. She had forgotten she had written it. "This is 12 years old," she said. "The argument is not." She asked about the compensation. He named a number for a single evening's work that was nearly equal to a month of her laundry shifts. She did not let her face change. She was becoming better at that. "There is one more thing," he said. "I need someone who can commit to discretion. What happens in this room and in the rooms associated with my business does not go elsewhere. This is not negotiable, and it is not about distrust. It is simply how I work. Rowan considered him. And you trust me with that, based on the paper I wrote in third year and the fact that Darcy said I was reliable. Darcy said you were the most reliable person she had ever met, and that you had been quietly paying half your mother's medical bills for 18 months, without telling anyone, including your mother. He paused. She also said she was worried about you. She said she had told you to ask for help and that you would not. The room was very quiet. You researched my financial situation, Rowan said. I looked at what was available. He did not look away from her. I am not offering you charity. I am offering you a job that requires exactly the skills you have. The fact that you need work is not why I am offering it. It is simply why I hope you will accept. She accepted. The dinner was on a Saturday in late January in the private dining room of a restaurant on Lower Water Street that had been closed to other guests for the evening. There were 12 people at the table. Rowan wore the one good dress she still owned, a deep green wool that she had bought for a gallery opening 3 years ago, and had barely worn since. She had borrowed a pair of earrings from Darcy. She had done her own hair, pulling it up in a way that she hoped read as deliberate rather than simply contained. Gabriel Ashworth introduced her as his cultural and linguistic consultant, which was a title she had not been given in advance, and which was precise enough that no one questioned it. She sat at the corner of the table where she could see the full room and catch his eye when needed, and she worked. She translated and she mediated, and she picked up on the moment when one of the Quebec investors made a joke that did not translate cleanly and transformed it into something that landed better. And on the moment when the guest from Shanghai said something that was formally deferential and actually deeply skeptical, and she found the language to bridge it without anyone at the table feeling managed. She was good at this. She had forgotten she was good at this. Halfway through the evening, one of the guests leaned across to her and said in French that she reminded him of someone he used to know, someone with a great deal of patience and very good instincts. He said it as a compliment. She thanked him in French and in English, and caught Gabriel Ashworth, looking at her from across the table, with an expression she could not quite categorize, something between appraisal and something else that she decided not to name. After the guests had left and the staff were clearing the last of the evening, Gabriel Ashworth found her in the hallway putting on her coat. "You were exceptional," he said. "I was doing my job." "Yes," he said. "That is what exceptional looks like when you are watching someone who was made for a particular kind of work and has been prevented from doing it." Rowan buttoned her coat. "That is very kind. It is accurate." He handed her an envelope. "There is also something additional in there. Before you refuse it," and she had been about to refuse it, she could feel the refusal already forming in her throat. "I want you to know it is not generosity. It is what the role actually pays when I hire someone for it through my agency. I underpaid you initially to get you to the table. That was not fair, and I am correcting it." She took the envelope in the tack. She opened it. She sat for a long time looking at what was inside. Then she took out her phone and transferred the amount to the account the hospital used for her mother's treatment. She did not send her mother a message. She just looked at the confirmation number on the screen until the taxi pulled up outside her building, and the driver said they had arrived. She worked for him again 3 weeks later, and then again. It became a pattern, not a fixed arrangement, but a recurring one. Each engagement offered with notice and accepted or declined on her terms. She declined twice, once because of Elliot's school concert, once because she had committed to covering a shift for a colleague at the hotel who was sick. Gabriel Ashworth did not comment on either refusal. He simply rescheduled. She began to understand over those weeks that he was a man who had been in control of most things for most of his life and had learned to be interesting about it. He did not perform authority. He simply operated within it the way other people operated within gravity, taking it as a condition of the environment rather than a personal achievement. He was more curious than she had expected. He asked about her work, about the paper she had written, about the classes she had taught. He listened in the particular way of someone who was accustomed to meetings where people talk to be heard rather than to communicate, and who found actual communication a somewhat rare and therefore interesting thing. He had a daughter. Rowan learned this 7 weeks in, when she arrived at the South End house for a briefing, and found a girl of perhaps 12 sitting at the kitchen table doing homework with the specific focused misery of someone who was very good at mathematics and found this fact deeply unrewarding. The girl's name was Breckenridge Ashworth, which her father called her in full, and which she herself shortened to Breck. "She goes to a school in Toronto," Gabriel Ashworth said, when Rowan came into the kitchen. "She is here for the week." He said this in a way that conveyed love without being soft about it, the way some parents spoke about their children when they were not sure how the child felt about being spoken about. Breck looked up from her homework. She looked at Rowan with the frank evaluation of a 12-year-old who had been around adults enough to have formed strong opinions about them. "Dad says you're a translator," she said. "Among other things." "What other things?" "I used to teach. Before that I was a student. Before that I was about your age and thought mathematics was something that happened to other people." Breck considered this. "I don't hate mathematics," she said, very carefully. "I just think it should be optional. Tell that to the economy," Rowan said. And Breck laughed in the sudden, surprised way of someone who had not expected to. Gabriel Ashworth was looking at her. She did not look back at him. The problem appeared on a Thursday morning in March, while the harbour was just beginning to consider the possibility of spring, and the ice was retreating in slow embarrassment from the edges of things. Rowan was at her kitchen table, marking up notes for an upcoming briefing, when her phone rang. It was a number she did not recognize, but she answered it because she had learned to always answer. The man on the other end said his name was Fielding and that he worked for Carmine Holdings, a name she did not know. He said that he understood she had been working with Gabriel Ashworth and that he was hoping to have a brief conversation with her about that work. He said the word informal twice, which in her experience meant that the conversation was not informal at all. She said she would need to think about it and that she would call him back. She hung up. Then she called Patrick, Gabriel Ashworth's assistant, and said she needed to speak with him as soon as possible. She was at the South End house within the hour. Gabriel Ashworth met her at the door himself, which was unusual. He led her to the study rather than the sitting room, which told her something. The study was where he did work that mattered. "Carmine Holdings," he said when she repeated the name. Something moved behind his eyes. Not alarm, exactly. The particular alertness of a person cataloguing information rather than reacting to it. "Where did you hear that name?" "A man named Fielding called me. He said he wanted to talk about you." "What did you tell him?" "That I would think about it." He was quiet for a moment. Then he walked to the window. The garden outside had the uncertain quality of March, neither committed to winter nor ready to release it. "Carmine Holdings is a company that has been trying to acquire a stake in my port operations for 2 years. I have declined. They have responded to this by attempting to pressure my partners, my suppliers, and on 2 occasions, members of my staff." He turned from the window. "What they would want from you is information. Details about our logistics contracts, our government agreements, possibly information about specific shipments. They would offer you money. They might eventually apply other kinds of pressure if you declined." Rowan let this settle. "And have you known they might approach me?" "I suspected it was a possibility." He said it directly, without evasion. "I should have told you. I did not because I did not want to alarm you without cause, and because He paused briefly. "I was aware that you might choose to step away if you understood the full picture, and I did not want you to step away." The room was quiet. "That was not your decision to make for me," she said. "No," he said. "It was not. I am sorry." She had not expected the apology. She had expected justification, the careful rearrangement of facts into a shape that looked like accountability without quite achieving it. That was what men in positions of power typically offered when they were called on something. Gabriel Ashworth simply said he was sorry, in a voice that did not perform the statement but simply made it. "What happens now?" she asked. "That is up to you." He sat down across from her. "You can stop working with me. I will understand it completely. What you have already done has been valuable, and you owe me nothing further." He folded his hands on the desk. "Or you can stay. But if you stay, I want you to know the full situation, not the version I have been rationing out, all of it." She looked at him for a long time. She thought about the letter, the one with 14 days. She thought about her mother at the kitchen table doing the crossword. She thought about Eliot's maps of cities that did not exist, drawn with the specific confidence of someone who believed new places were always possible. "Tell me all of it," she said. He did. The story of Carmine Holdings was the story of what happened when someone decided that patience and the law and legitimate competition were impediments to the outcome they wanted. They had begun as a real company, had done real work, and had then made a series of decisions that took them so far from that starting point that the original company was mostly a legal structure holding a very different thing. They had people in positions they should not have been in. They had exerted pressure in ways that were technically legal and practically coercive. They wanted Gabriel Ashworth's port operations not because they were particularly lucrative in themselves, but because of what they connected. The government contracts, the security clearances, the access those things provided to information that had a different kind of value. "I have been building a file on them for 18 months, Gabriel Ashworth said, "working with legal counsel, and quietly, with people in the federal government who share my concern. What I need is more time, and what they want is to disrupt that time by removing the people around me, by creating enough uncertainty in my business relationships that I am forced to negotiate from weakness. And you think they'll use me to do that? I think Fielding's call was a test. They want to know whether you are a vulnerability. Rowan sat with this. What happens if I call him back and tell him I have nothing to say to him? They will likely try again through a different approach. They are patient in the way that people are patient when they believe they are going to win. And if I do not call him back at all? The same, but perhaps slower. She thought about it overnight. She sat with Elliot that evening, who was at her table again, because Lynn had a difficult week, and she watched him work on a new map. This one had a harbor in it, with ships she recognized as spaceships that had learned to float. He told her the city's name was something he had not decided yet, because he wanted to make sure it fit before he committed it to paper. That is a very good principle, she said. He looked up at her. He had her sister's coloring and her father's seriousness in the eyes, and something else entirely that was entirely his own. Are you worried about something a little? Is it money? She looked at him. 8 years old. Not exactly. Mum worries about money, he said, without judgment, just information. She makes a certain face. You are making a different face. What face am I making? He studied her with the seriousness he brought to cartography. Like you are deciding something. Like when you decide what route to take and you are not sure which one is safe. She pulled him close and held on for a moment. He let her. In the morning she called Fielding back. She told him she was not in a position to discuss her professional engagements with third parties, that she valued her reputation for discretion as much as she valued any other professional asset, and that if Carmine Holdings had legitimate business to conduct with Gabriel Ashworth, they were welcome to pursue it through the appropriate channels. She said all of this in a voice that was entirely calm. Then she hung up. She called Patrick and told him what she had said. He relayed it to Gabriel Ashworth, who called her 20 minutes later. You did not have to do that, he said. I know. Are you all right? The question surprised her, not because it was unexpected from him. She had come to understand that he asked direct questions rather than assuming answers, but because she genuinely had to think about it. Yes, she said after a moment. I think I am. There was a pause on the line. Good, he said. There is something I want to show you if you are willing. Tomorrow morning, the Dartmouth facility. She went. The cold storage facility in Dartmouth was larger than she had imagined, a complex of buildings that hummed with a particular kind of industrial seriousness, the sound of something that did not stop when people went home. Gabriel Ashworth met her at the entrance and walked her through the operations with the specific attention of someone, showing you something they had built and cared about deeply, without knowing how to say so outright. He explained the logistics, the contracts, the supply chains that connected this building to communities across the province and beyond. He introduced her to people by name. They knew him, not with the careful deference of people navigating an employer's presence, but with the ease of people who saw him regularly enough to have formed an actual opinion. In the break room, he poured them both coffee from a machine that had seen better days and did not apologize for it. Why are you showing me this? She asked. He held his coffee cup in both hands, looking at the window that faced the water. Because you made a decision yesterday that had real consequences for you, and you made it without full certainty about the outcome, and I wanted you to understand what you were protecting. He looked at her. Not me, this. The people who work here, the commitments I have made to suppliers who depend on these contracts, the agreements that took years to build and could be undone if Carmine gets what they want. Rowan looked at the building, at the workers moving through the space with the efficiency of people who knew exactly what they were doing and why it mattered. I was a teacher for 8 years, she said. I spent 8 years trying to get teenagers to understand that the things they did had consequences beyond the immediate moment, that the choices they made would be felt by people they could not see. She paused. I still believe that. He looked at her for a long moment. I know, he said. That is why you were the right person. The resolution came in April, not dramatically, but steadily, the way most important things resolve, through accumulated pressure and preparation and the particular kind of patience that does not look like patience from the outside because it is too busy working. The file Gabriel Ashworth had been building was completed. The people in the federal government who had been quietly monitoring Carmine Holdings were no longer quiet about it. There were meetings and disclosures and, eventually, a very brief article in the business section of the paper that described a regulatory investigation in language so careful it barely seemed like news, but which Gabriel Ashworth read at the kitchen table of the South End house, with the expression of someone who had been waiting a very long time for a particular thing to be over. Rowan was there when he read it. She had come to review the notes from a briefing, and she had stayed for coffee, and then the paper had arrived, and Breck had come downstairs in her pajamas and immediately sensed the change in the quality of her father's stillness and asked what had happened. "Something that needed to end has ended," he said. Breck looked at Rowan. Rowan looked back at her. There was something in the girl's expression that was easier to read than her father's, the straightforward relief of someone who had understood more than the adults around her had given her credit for. "Is she staying for breakfast?" Breck asked. "If she would like to," Gabriel Ashworth said, without looking up from the paper. Rowan stayed for breakfast. She called her mother that afternoon, not to tell her about any of it. There was too much to explain, and her mother did not need the particular retroactive anxiety of learning what her daughter had been navigating, but simply to call. To hear her voice. Her mother was in good spirits. The treatment was going well. The doctor had used a word that was close enough to encouraging that Geraldine Kitch had chosen to take it as encouragement. She had finished a crossword without looking anything up. She was, she said, completely fine. "You always say that," Rowan said. "And I am usually right," her mother said. Rowan laughed. Outside the window of her apartment, Halifax was doing something that looked tentatively like spring. The harbour had lost its grey and was considering blue. Somewhere in the city, in his mother's apartment, Elliot was probably drawing a map of a place that did not exist yet. She thought about what it meant to spend a very long time believing you were getting smaller. Losing ground, losing work, losing the version of yourself that you recognized. And then to discover that you had not been getting smaller at all, that the person you were was still entirely there, just waiting for the right kind of work to make it visible again. She thought about Gabriel Ashworth, about the way he had apologized without qualification, about the facility in Dartmouth and the workers who had nodded at him, like he was a person they genuinely knew, about Breck and her maps and her serious eyes, and the way she had looked at Rowan across the kitchen table with the frank assessment of someone deciding whether a person was worth trusting. She thought that the answer for all of them was probably yes. 3 months later, when spring had become something confident, and the harbour was fully itself again, and the gardens on the South End were doing what gardens in Halifax did when finally permitted, which was to make the entire city feel briefly possible, Gabriel Ashworth asked if she would consider a permanent position, not just the event work, not just the individual engagements, but a formal role as cultural director of the Atlantic expansion, an office, a contract, a salary that would make the laundry shifts and the cafe shifts and the survey forms a closed chapter of a story. She would eventually be able to look back on with something other than exhaustion. He said it over coffee, in the sitting room of the South End house, with the careful precision of a man who had drafted the question several times in advance and then decided to say it plainly anyway. "There is nothing charitable about the offer," he said, because he knew she would need to hear that first. "You have been doing this work for 4 months. I have watched you navigate situations that most people with twice your experience could not have managed. You are exact, and you are quick, and you understand things that are not said as well as things that are, and that is genuinely rare." He paused. "Also, Breck asked me twice this week whether you were coming back." Rowan looked at her coffee. "Twice," he confirmed. "I did not prompt her, I know you didn't." She looked up at him. He was watching her with that same expression she had noticed at the dinner months ago, the one she had decided not to name. She named it now, quietly, to herself. It was the expression of someone who had stopped performing certainty and was simply in the presence of something they did not want to lose. "Yes," she said. She called her mother that evening to tell her not everything but enough. Her mother listened without interrupting, which was not her usual approach. When Rowan finished, there was a pause. "Are you happy?" her mother said. Rowan looked out the window at the harbour. The evening light was doing something generous with the water, turning it into shades of gold and rose that had no business being that beautiful in a city this practical. "I think I am becoming happy," she said, which feels more honest than saying yes outright. Her mother made a small sound that was almost a laugh. "That is the Keach approach to good news," she said. "We accept it cautiously, we check it for hidden costs, and then, when it turns out to be real, we let ourselves have it." Rowan stayed on the phone for a long time after that, long past the point where they were saying anything important. Just talking the way you talked to someone you loved when you had been through a hard passage together and had come out the other side into something that looked, tentatively but genuinely, like land.